Hello, my friends. Welcome to Timeline English. I am so glad you are here today. Take a slow breath, find a comfortable place, and let this story begin. Imagine a small wooden shed on the outskirts of Paris, late at night, in the year 1898. The shed has no proper floor, just packed earth. Rain leaks through gaps in the roof. It is bitterly cold in winter and unbearably hot in summer. And inside, surrounded by heavy sacks of crushed rock, a woman in a plain, acid-stained dress stands stirring a huge pot of boiling liquid with an iron rod nearly as tall as she is, her arms aching, her eyes burning from the fumes. She has been doing this day after day for months. And on this particular night, she notices something strange. In the darkness of the shed, a faint, pale, blue-green light seems to be glowing softly from the shelves where her purified samples sit. She is looking, for the very first time in human history, at the glow of a substance so radioactive it will eventually be given a name drawn straight from the Latin word for a ray of light: radium. Her name was Maria Sklodowska. The world would come to know her as Marie Curie, and she would become the first person, man or woman, to win a Nobel Prize twice, in two entirely different sciences. But her story does not begin in a laboratory at all. It begins in a country that, at the time, did not officially exist on any map. But first, you must understand something about the world Maria was born into. In the 1860s, Poland was not an independent nation. It had been divided up years earlier between three powerful neighboring empires: Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The city of Warsaw, where Maria was born, sat inside the portion controlled by the Russian Empire, and Russian authorities worked hard to erase Polish language, Polish history, and Polish identity from daily life. Speaking Polish in schools was often forbidden. Higher education for women was almost entirely closed off. Remember this, because it shapes nearly every difficult choice Maria will have to make in the years ahead. Maria Sklodowska was born on the 7th of November, 1867, the youngest of 5 children. Both of her parents were teachers, and education was treated in her household almost like a sacred value. Her father taught mathematics and physics, and often brought scientific instruments home from his school, letting his curious youngest daughter examine them closely, planting, without either of them realizing it, the earliest seeds of her future career. But Maria's childhood was marked by loss far earlier than most children ever experience. When she was only 10 years old, her mother, a devoted teacher herself, died of tuberculosis, a disease that had slowly taken her strength for years. Not long before that, Maria's eldest sister had also died from typhus. By the time Maria was 10 years old, she had already learned that the people you love most in the world can be taken from you without warning. Around this same time, Maria's father lost a significant portion of the family's savings through a poor investment, plunging a once comfortable household into real financial difficulty. Despite all of this, Maria excelled at school. She had, by every account, an extraordinary memory, and at 16 years old, she graduated at the very top of her class, earning a gold medal for her achievement. And then, she hit a wall that no amount of talent or hard work could move on its own. The University of Warsaw did not accept women as students. It did not matter how brilliant she was. The doors were simply closed to her because of one fact about her that she could not change. Rather than give up on learning entirely, Maria and many other young Polish women turned to something called the Floating University, a secret, illegal network of underground classes held in shifting locations across Warsaw, specifically to avoid detection by Russian authorities. Floating means moving from place to place rather than staying fixed in one location. There, in borrowed rooms and private apartments, young women studied science and literature and mathematics, fully aware that being caught could mean serious punishment. But Maria and her sister Bronislawa shared an even bigger dream: to study abroad at a real university in a country where women were actually permitted to earn a proper degree. The problem, as it so often was for this family, was money. There simply was not enough for both sisters to study abroad at the same time. So the two sisters made a pact. Maria would work for years if necessary as a governess, teaching other families' children, and send a portion of her wages to Paris to help pay for Bronislawa's medical studies. Governess means a woman employed to teach and care for children in a private household. Once Bronislawa qualified as a doctor, she would, in turn, help fund Maria's own education. It was a promise built entirely on trust and patience, two sisters betting their futures on each other, years in advance. For roughly 5 long years, Maria worked as a governess in the Polish countryside, far from home, teaching other people's children by day, and secretly continuing her own education by candlelight at night, reading physics, chemistry, and mathematics whenever she found a spare, exhausted hour. During this period, she also fell in love with the son of the family she worked for. His family disapproved of the relationship entirely, considering a poor governess an unsuitable match for their son, and the relationship ended painfully. It was, by most accounts, one of the more quietly devastating chapters of her youth, rarely discussed later in her life, but deeply felt at the time. Finally, in the year 1891, at 24 years old, with her sister's promised support now finally in place, Maria boarded a train for Paris. She arrived with almost nothing. Determined not to be a burden on her sister's own new household, she soon moved into a tiny, freezing attic room of her own near the university, sometimes called a garret. Garret means a small, cramped room at the very top of a building, usually poorly heated and modestly furnished. Money was, once again, desperately tight. She survived, according to her own later accounts, largely on bread, butter, and tea, and sometimes fainted from simple hunger during her studies. She would work far into the night in that small room, often too absorbed in her equations to notice the cold. It was here, in Paris, that Maria Sklodowska formally became Marie, the French version of her name, as she enrolled at the Sorbonne, one of the most respected universities in the world. In 1893, she earned her degree in physics, finishing first in her entire class. The following year, she earned a second degree in mathematics. It was also in 1894 that she met a man who would change the course of both of their lives, a physicist named Marie Curie, already respected for his own research into crystals and magnetism. They were introduced by a mutual acquaintance who thought the two brilliant, quietly serious scientists might have a great deal in common. They did. Pierre was drawn immediately to Marie's sharp intellect and her fierce, uncompromising dedication to her work, qualities that closely mirrored his own. The following year, in 1895, they married in a simple ceremony. Marie reportedly wore not a traditional wedding gown, but a plain, practical dark blue outfit she could continue wearing afterward in the laboratory. Together, Marie and Pierre began investigating a strange and barely understood phenomenon that had recently been discovered by another physicist, Henri Becquerel, an invisible energy given off by certain uranium compounds, capable of passing through solid materials and even affecting photographic plates sealed away in darkness. Marie became fascinated by this mysterious energy and made it the subject of her own doctoral research, eventually giving this entirely new field of study a name that scientists still use today: radioactivity. Working with almost no funding in that leaking, drafty wooden shed that had originally been intended simply as a dissection room for a nearby medical school, Marie and Pierre began processing enormous quantities of a mineral called pitchblende, painstakingly searching for the source of its unusually strong radioactivity. The work was slow, physically brutal, and repetitive almost beyond imagination. Marie would later describe standing for hours, stirring boiling vats of chemicals with an iron rod nearly as tall as her own body, her hands and clothing permanently stained by acid and chemical residue. In 1898, their exhausting labor finally began to pay off. They identified not one, but two entirely new chemical elements hidden within the pitchblende. Marie named the first one polonium, after her native Poland, a quiet, deliberate act of scientific defiance toward the empire that had once denied her people even the right to study their own language openly. The second element, even more intensely radioactive, she named radium, from the Latin word for ray, in honor of the strange, powerful energy it gave off. To prove radium truly existed as a distinct new element, rather than simply accepting the theoretical evidence, Marie insisted on physically isolating a visible, measurable sample of pure radium metal itself. This meant processing tons, literally tons, of raw pitchblende ore by hand, boiling it down again and again and again over years to extract only a tiny, precious fraction of pure material. It was during this grueling, years-long process that Marie first witnessed radium's eerie glow lighting up the darkness of their small shed at night, a sight she and Pierre reportedly found endlessly beautiful, having no real understanding yet of just how dangerous that same glowing light truly was. In 1903, Marie completed her doctoral thesis on radioactivity, becoming the first woman in France to ever earn a doctorate of science. That same year, the Nobel Prize Committee in Sweden announced that the physics prize would be shared between Henri Becquerel, Pierre Curie, and, remarkably, Marie Curie herself, for their combined work on radioactivity. It is worth pausing here on something important. The Nobel Committee's original nomination, according to historical records, did not actually include Marie's name at all, only Pierre's and Becquerel's. It was Pierre himself, informed of this by a sympathetic mathematician on the nominating committee, who insisted, quietly but firmly, that any prize recognizing this research simply could not leave out the woman who had led so much of it. Marie Curie became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. Fame arrived, somewhat uncomfortably, for two people who mostly wanted to be left alone with their research. Marie and Pierre largely avoided the public spotlight where they could, continuing their demanding work while also raising two young daughters, Irene and later Eve. Then, in April of 1906, tragedy struck without warning. Pierre, crossing a rain-soaked Paris street, was struck and killed instantly by a horse-drawn cart. Marie was, by every account, utterly devastated. She had lost not only her husband, but her closest scientific collaborator, and in many ways, the one person who had always fully understood the demands and the isolation of her work. In her private journal, she wrote to Pierre directly, as though he could still somehow read her words, pouring out grief that she rarely allowed the outside world to see. And yet, only weeks after the funeral, Marie made a decision that surprised many at the time. Rather than step away from their shared research, she asked to take over her late husband's position at the Sorbonne. The university agreed, and Marie Curie became the first woman ever to teach there in the institution's long history. Her first lecture, delivered to a hall packed with curious onlookers and journalists as much as actual students, began, according to those present, in the exact place Pierre's own final lecture notes had left off, as though simply continuing a conversation that had merely been interrupted. Over the following years, Marie continued her relentless pursuit of pure radium, and in 1911, the Nobel Committee in Sweden recognized her again, this time awarding her the full, unshared Nobel Prize in Chemistry for successfully isolating pure radium metal itself. She had now won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 entirely different scientific fields, physics and chemistry, an achievement no other person, man or woman, has matched to this day. That same year, however, brought Marie's most painful public ordeal. News broke of a private relationship between the widowed Marie and a married former student of Pierre's, a physicist named Paul Langevin, whose own marriage was already deeply troubled. The French press seized on the story with startling cruelty, some newspapers attacking Marie savagely. Partly, historians widely agree, simply because she was a foreign-born woman who had dared to achieve so much in a field so thoroughly dominated by French men. An angry crowd even gathered outside her home at one point, forcing her briefly to take her children and stay elsewhere for their own safety. Remarkably, the very same week this scandal was consuming the Paris newspapers, the telegram arrived from Sweden, confirming her second Nobel Prize. When a member of the Nobel Committee, worried about the public controversy, quietly suggested she might consider not traveling to Sweden to accept the award in person, Marie's response was firm and unwavering. The prize, she wrote back, had been awarded for her scientific achievements, and her private life had absolutely no bearing whatsoever on that fact. She traveled to Stockholm and accepted the award herself, in person, exactly as she had earned the right to do. Then, in the summer of 1914, war broke out across Europe. Marie, now in her late 40s, made a decision that surprised many who assumed a world-famous scientist would simply retreat into the safety of a laboratory. Instead, she threw herself into a completely new kind of work, developing and personally organizing mobile X-ray units to be sent directly to the front lines of battle, allowing doctors to quickly locate bullets and shrapnel inside wounded soldiers' bodies, dramatically increasing their chances of survival. X-ray means a type of invisible ray capable of passing through the body to create an image of what lies beneath the skin. Marie personally learned to drive and to repair basic engine problems so she could operate these mobile units herself, ferrying vital equipment directly to military hospitals across France and Belgium. French soldiers affectionately nicknamed these vehicles Petites Curies, meaning little Curies. By the war's end, it is estimated that more than 1 million wounded soldiers had been treated using X-ray equipment that Marie had either directly developed or personally helped train hundreds of technicians to operate. After the war, Marie continued her research at the Radium Institute in Paris, an institution she had helped establish specifically to advance the study of radioactivity and its potential medical applications, particularly in the emerging treatment of cancer. Researchers trained under her supervision at the institute would go on in the decades that followed to win additional Nobel Prizes of their own, including her own daughter, Irene, who won a Nobel Prize in Chemistry alongside her husband in 1935, carrying her mother's extraordinary scientific legacy directly into the next generation. But there was a darker cost to all of this pioneering work, one that Marie herself, and indeed the entire scientific community, did not yet fully understand. In the era before the true dangers of radiation exposure were properly recognized, Marie had spent decades working directly and largely unprotected, with intensely radioactive materials. She carried test tubes of radium salts in her pockets simply because she found their faint glow beautiful. She kept a sample on her desk at night as a kind of glowing lamp. Her own laboratory notebooks, preserved to this day, remain so radioactive that researchers who wish to examine them must still sign a liability waiver and wear appropriate protective equipment even now, nearly a century later. By the early 1930s, Marie's health had begun to deteriorate seriously. Fatigue, dizziness, and a slow, steady decline that doctors at the time struggled to fully explain. On the 4th of July, 1934, Marie Curie died at the age of 66 from a form of blood disease known as aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused, modern doctors now widely agree, by her decades of prolonged exposure to radiation. The very substance that had brought her 2 Nobel Prizes, international fame, and the tools to save the lives of over 1 million wounded soldiers had also, slowly and invisibly, cost her own life. And so, my friends, the story of Marie Curie comes quietly to its close. A girl born in a country erased from the map by foreign empires, denied admission to her own capital city's university simply for being a woman. A young woman who spent 5 long years teaching other people's children so that one day she might finally be allowed to learn herself. A widow who, instead of retreating from grief, walked directly into her late husband's lecture hall and continued exactly where he had left off. And yet, she became the first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize, and remains, to this very day, the only person in history, man or woman, to win that prize in 2 entirely separate sciences. Elements bear her name. Hospitals, research institutes, and university buildings across the world still carry it too. And treatments developed from her research continue, to this day, to help doctors fight cancer in patients who will never know her name at all. She made a choice, again and again, through poverty, through grief, through public cruelty that would have broken many people entirely. She chose, every single time, to return to her work, not because it was easy, but because she believed, quietly and completely, that it mattered. Now, my friend, I want to say something to you. You are making a choice too. Every time you press play on a story like this, you are choosing something. You are choosing to grow. You are choosing to learn. You are choosing to give your time and your effort to something that is not always easy, but something that truly matters. Learning English is not easy. There are days when the words feel heavy, when progress feels impossibly slow, when every door still seems to be closed to you. The way university doors were once closed to a brilliant young woman in Warsaw simply because of who she was. But look at what Marie built, one small, exhausting step at a time. She did not wait for the world to make things easy for her. She worked as a governess for 5 years, just for the chance to study. She stirred boiling vats of chemicals for years, just to isolate a single, tiny sample of something new. You are building something too. Every word you understand, every sentence you follow from beginning to end, every small moment when English feels a little less like a locked door and a little more like an open one, that is proof. Proof that you are more capable and more patient than you think. Marie Curie turned 5 years of quiet, unglamorous work into a doorway that led to 2 Nobel Prizes. You are turning quiet, patient effort into a skill that will open doors in your own life that you cannot yet fully imagine. Keep listening, keep learning, keep going. This is Timeline English. If Marie's story moved you today, please leave a comment below. Tell me, Has a door ever felt completely closed to you? And how did you find a way through it anyway? I would love to hear your thoughts. There are many more stories waiting right here. Come back soon, my friend.